The interesting thing, I think, about King George III, Marie, I can do episodes anywhere, is that he carried one of the catchiest labels in history. He was called Mad King George, and that's catchy. But it also becomes a problem if it now turns out he wasn't mad. And my first instinct is to think, well, it's not that big a problem. You just have to grab the 17,000 biographies that have been written on King George III in the last 250 years and pulp them and write a new one. You know, that sounds easy enough. Recall everything, like you recall, Toyotas if they've got a faulty seatbelt. Just do that. Okay, as like if we all know that I'm mad, and okay, here we go. If it turns out that I'm actually sane, that biography you're writing on me right now, bin it, and start again. You're safe. Keep going. All right. Now, Mad King George. If it turns out he's not mad, which is something I think they're finding out now, we've got a bigger problem than just pulping his biographies. Don't they know I've got some important things to talk about here? All right. Okay, if he wasn't mad, we've got a bigger problem than pulping his biographies. I think pretty much every history book, and I didn't come up with this idea. People have been telling me this on audiobooks. They've been asking me this question: is it true that most history books on the entire establishment of the United States of America, for example, and the establishment of Australia, both those things happened during King George III's reign, and all sorts of other things leading up to the American War of Independence, and all sorts of shenanigans going on, between England and France, and internally in England, and all that sort of stuff. The fact that he was called Mad King George, people that loomed large, I bet, in people's imaginations as they went to try and explain all sorts of complicated things that were happening back in those times, in the lead up to the War of Independence and all, and the rest of it, the carrying out of the War of Independence, George Washington versus King George III and all that sort of thing, and then the decision making that led to the establishment of Australia, all that sort of stuff. Now, if the king is mad, doesn't that become a kind of a go-to explanation? Now, obviously, it's not going to explain everything, but gee, it's going to explain a lot. And Andrew Roberts, an author I was reading, I was listening to recently, suggested that the fact that everyone thought he was mad, it turns out he probably had some sort of bipolar disorder, episodes of manic depression and all that sort of stuff. But in between the episodes, he was quite rational. I'll leave it at that. You can be bipolar and not mad. What if he was reasonable and rational throughout his reign, when he was making decisions at least? Well, that's a big problem, because Andrew Roberts suggested that if you've got 10,000 books on the War of Independence, underpinning most of those books is the fact that the king was mad. Now, you wouldn't be able to unpick that and trace it back and all that sort of stuff, because most of those books would have been written by authors who had researched their subject carefully, the War of Independence, and read a whole lot of other authors. But all of those authors were relying on the fact that the king was mad. And if you've got a decision that's been made to do with whatever, taxation, leading up to the American War of Independence, and the Boston Tea Party or whatever, and so on and so forth, and the king is mad, well, you start with that, don't you? But and to a certain extent, Andrew Roberts was arguing the fact that the king was mad, was probably too convenient. It was a convenient. He reckons that it probably colours. The incorrect information, quite possibly, that the king was mad, has coloured the reasons for all sorts of things to do with the War of Independence and all sorts of other things back in the reign of King George III. And how do you unpick all of that? What do you do? Pulp every history book? Because, pretty much, he reckons, pretty much every history book on the War of Independence, if it involved King George III, and most of them do, the fact that he was mad sits underneath due to the power of labelling. When you label someone mad, that becomes a very attractive. You don't work hard after all that. Oh, King George III has triggered, the Boston Tea Party. Oh, gee, there might be complex reasons that go into that. And, we should really work hard to work out what the reasons are. What? The king's mad? Oh, short book. The king is mad. Yeah, all right. That's the reason, George Washington, very sensible. King George III, mad. All right, there's other things, but that's the main thing. And he reckons that's that has polluted. He wouldn't have used that word. The fact that he was mad would have polluted most histories ever written that had anything to do with King George III. Not just biographies, but all sorts of histories. That's what he reckons anyway. I've only got 2 minutes before this office works closes.